everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm Sharon Kyle of LA Progressive. This is my husband, Dick Price. We're so happy that you are here to join us to listen to the wonderful Professor Richard Wolff. And before the program begins, we want to say a couple of things. Dick, you want to thank some people?
Yeah, I want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank Ella Tureen, Dean Ella Tureen, who here's at Occidental, who arranged for this to have this room. There's also two students, Riley Goulet and Liliana Hinkle, who are here someplace, who showed up to help. Carol Francis obviously helped here at the last minute. And I must say, I just had a wonderful afternoon with Rick Wolff. Couldn't have been better. And the last people I want to thank are all you folks for showing up.
Okay, so before we begin.
Thank you.
You know, Rick has come to California several times over the past few years, and this movement is really growing. And an example of how it's growing is standing right here to my right, these two wonderful young people who are going to introduce themselves and tell you what they have in the front vestibule area.
Hello everyone, my name is Liz Phillips.
Andrea Yanone.
And about a year ago, Democracy at Work started supporting the creation of local action groups. We are one of 18 action groups across the world. And so here we are in Los Angeles, furthering the mission of democracy at work right here on a local level. We have monthly meetings where we do education and advocacy and training. We reach out with lots of local organizations and partner with lots of people. We're working on short-term and long-term projects on the side. If you are interested in learning or doing something, we are a place where you can come and do that.
I just want to say, democracy at work means something. It's what's on a lot of the chairs, a lot of the pamphlets that we've spammed your seats with. But what we're trying to do is bring democracy into workplaces. So we're trying to facilitate and advocate for the conversion of businesses to worker cooperatives, because we believe that will really fundamentally change society. It will change how people relate to each other. I'm sure Wolff will talk much more about that. But at a macro level, it'll change the employer-employee relationship. That's kind of odious. At a micro level, most of the times, workers and worker cooperatives are happier, and they tend to be less alienated from their jobs. So that's something that we want to see realized in society, and that's what we're working towards. So thank you, Dick and Sharon, for supporting us today. And please come find out more information. We're in the front, and we'll be there after the talk. Thank you.
Okay, so now the reason that you are all here. Professor Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor at the New School University in New York. His groundbreaking book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, inspired the creation of the nonprofit organization Democracy at Work, which now has chapters in several states, including the two young people that you just saw. His book is available for those his latest book, Capitalism in Crisis, is here and is available for sale after he's done his talk. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Wolff.
Excuse me while I get my electronics organized here. So thank you all for coming to hear what I have to say. I'm going to try to make it interesting and relevant for all of you. Because of the topic that Dick and Sharon helped inspire in me, I'm going to take a little bit of a chance and talk to you about something that here in the United States has been a bit of a taboo. I'm being polite. It's been a total taboo for half a century. And so we're going to talk about it tonight. And for those of you who already know all of this, bear with me. I think it'll get better later on. And for those of you who don't, maybe this is a catch-up course. To remind everyone, in World War II, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. Americans of all ages don't know that, which is very strange. It meant that in the years 1941 to 1945, if you walked into a post office in the United States, you would have likely seen a poster over the clerk's window. And there you would have seen someone who looked like Uncle Sam with a nice hat and the usual outfit, arm in arm with somebody identified as Uncle Joe. That referred to Joseph Stalin, because Uncle Joe and Uncle Sam were allies in World War II. So imagine the difficulty for the American people when the war was over to discover that Uncle Joe was the worst thing imaginable and Uncle Sam was his sworn enemy. There they had been so cozy over above the postal clerk's office. Starting in 1945 then, everything having to do with the Soviet Union, and therefore with its claims of being a socialist country, USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, everything having to do with socialism, with the Communist Party, because that was the name of the party around the world that was allied with the Soviet Union, everything having to do with those things was rendered taboo in the United States. If you had had any kind of association with anything with those names attached to it, you disconnected yourself as fast as you could, because otherwise your friends and neighbors would look at you in a funny way that you did not want. Your employer would reconsider your situation as to whether or not you should keep your job. The government would start listening to what you were saying over the telephone, and on and on and on. For 50 years, or rather it's closer to 70 now, from 1945 on, this country, apropos of socialism and communism, shut down. Those things were unmitigated disasters, evil, awful, murderous, you fill in the blank with whatever gory adjectives come to your mind. So complete was the taboo that it was important for Americans not only to hate this thing, but to know absolutely nothing about it. It was not taught, the books were not assigned, the speakers were never invited. There was no way to learn about this unless you went to the library, checked those books out, and discovered that the librarian was now looking at you funnily also. So you stopped. A bit of personal history. I went to what these colleges in America like to call themselves the best schools in America. I was a student at Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and I finished at Yale. It's like a joke, only it's true. And the reason I tell you is not in order to waive my pedigree, although sometimes that's very useful, I admit that. Certainly the most valuable thing those institutions ever gave me was the pedigree. But in those years, 10 of my life, that I spent in those three institutions, studying economics, I was never required to read one word of Karl Marx. That's not an achievement. That's pathetic. That's the behavior of frightened people, so frightened of what is an important movement in the world that the best possible approach is to stick your head into the ground and pretend it's not there, like a 2-year-old confronted by a dog. Puts her hands or his hands in front of their face and imagines that the dog has gone. Until, of course, the hands are removed and the dog is still there. It's a real sad commentary, but it means that Americans, I'm sure everyone in this room is an exception, but other people don't know really well much about socialism and communism, because we live in a society that just experienced 70 years of total taboo. So I want to undo that with your indulgence, because it's important for the following obvious reason. Capitalism, the system we live in, the system that organizes production around two key players, the employer and the employee. That's the way we organize production. In every store, in every factory, in every office, there's the employer and the employee. You all know it because most of you have played one of those two roles, and you know sorrily which one it is. All right? That was not an intentional sound effect, but it was well timed. Thank you. This employer-employee relationship follows two prior arrangements for production that existed over the previous 2,000 years. One was called feudalism, which organized everything around the lord and the serf. And before that, it was slavery, and everything was organized around master and slave. If you notice a certain parallel, good. Because we'll come back to that more than a few times tonight. Every system that the human race has devised so far to produce the goods and services without which we cannot live, our food, our clothing, our shelter, and everything else, every system that has come into existence has two qualities I want you to keep in mind. Number one, the system is born, it evolves, and then it dies. And number two, every system has produced the people in it who love it and the people in it who don't. Capitalism is no different from any of the other systems in this regard. Like slavery, it was born, evolved. Like slavery, it'll die. And like feudalism, it was born and evolved, and like feudalism, ... And from the beginning of capitalism, 300 years ago roughly, in England, from which it spread to northwestern Europe and then the rest of the world, so that is the universal system these days. Throughout the history of capitalism, it has had the people who welcome and celebrate it, and the people who basically think we as a human race can and should do better. And just because the United States for 60 years was unable, unwilling to face any of what I just said, doesn't change it in one iota. We're just late 70 years to face what a mature society would have been debating over the last 70 years, which is what the relationship between capitalism is, its present, its future, and the alternatives to it. So we have to catch up. In most other countries, as I assume you know, the debate over capitalism versus its major alternative, socialism, has been going on quite nicely, thank you, for the last 70 years. Many of you travel in your summertime vacations to places like France and Italy, blithely unaware that you're entering into the most dangerous imaginable place where they actually talk about and debate capitalism versus socialism. If you've ever been to Paris and you've gone on their remarkable subway system, which demonstrates another stunning reality for Americans, that a subway system can be pleasant, can be clean. I live in New York. It's not pleasant, and it's one of the filthiest places on earth. But if you go to Paris and you ride on the subway, I've got news for you. The union from which all subway drivers derive, and of which they are members, is a union of the Communist Party. You are sitting, get ready, in a communist subway. And for those of you that have done it, look at yourself. You survived. And if there were a communist union in the United States, you would have survived too, even if it wasn't possible for 75 years to think about it. So let's do it. In economics, the field that I teach, capitalism was originally celebrated by two major thinkers, both British, because that's where it began, in the 18th century. One, the name most of you have heard, Adam Smith, And the other one, a name you may not have heard, but was just as important, David Ricardo. One was a professor of religious studies in Glasgow, in Scotland, and that was Smith, and Mr. Ricardo was a banker in London. They wrote great books celebrating this new system that had emerged out of feudalism, this capitalism. Because they were sophisticated thinkers, celebrating capitalism did not mean that it was all a wonderful, perfect creation that had no flaws. This would have struck them as childish. They were not modern the way we are. They understood the subtleties. They celebrated capitalism. And they believed, with those who came afterwards, that capitalism was a major step forward in human history, a tremendous advance over feudalism and slavery that could and would not only free the human beings from the drudgery, from the imprisonment in slavery and feudalism, but would usher in a new world that was what all human beings hoped for. And nothing said it better than the slogan of the French Revolution, 1789, during which time Adam Smith was alive and David Ricardo likewise. The slogan, if you don't remember, was liberty, equality, and fraternity, the three great slogans of the French Revolution. They believed, the people at that time, that capitalism would overthrow feudalism and bring in liberty, equality, and fraternity. They even believed in their enthusiasm that the only way you could get liberty, equality, and fraternity was by having capitalism, that the two went together. That's what they believed. That's what they made a revolution in the name of. A revolution, for those of you that need a reminder, that was extremely bloody. Capitalism was born, as one great thinker wrote, dripping blood from every corner. Which means that for those of you that have noticed that revolutions against capitalism can be bloody, this simply means that the revolutions against them are mirroring and repeating how capitalism itself came into the world. So there we have it, the end of the 18th century, entering into the 19th, capitalism replacing feudalism, bringing us liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this was continued in the thinking of many who took their inspiration from Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Except that as capitalism spread from England to France to the Low Countries and on across Europe, and eventually beyond that, it turned out that for a number of people, as they looked around the new world that capitalism was bringing, they were impressed with the technological changes that capitalism brought, for sure. They were impressed with the cities that arose with capitalism, very impressive. But when they looked around for liberty, equality, and fraternity, they couldn't find it. You know about this, even if you don't remember, because that's what the novels of Charles Dickens were about. England had capitalism, all right, but those other three were sadly missing. Mr. Micawber, Oliver Twist, And if you had read the other great novelists of the time, ditto. It was only a matter of time before a thinker would arise who said, hey, let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen. We got capitalism, and I think it's an advance, this thinker said. It is. It's an advance over feudalism. It's an advance over slavery. It develops technology. It develops the city. It develops culture. But as a vehicle for liberty, equality, and fraternity, not at all. Not only doesn't it bring them, it is the obstacle to achieving them. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Who's that thinker? Karl Marx, That's what he said. Karl Marx was in love with the French Revolution. Like people his age all across Europe, it was the great liberational struggle. He admired Robespierre, Danton, all of the great French revolutionaries. He wanted all of that to come to his native Germany. He welcomed the arrival of the principles of the French Revolution. He loved the idea of capitalism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But unlike the celebrants, when it didn't pan out, when the revolutionary hopes of the people who brought you capitalism out of feudalism turned out not to be realized, he did not shrink from saying, hey, it's not there. We didn't get liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so he set himself a project. Why didn't it happen? Why did the capitalist revolution that we welcomed not bring us liberty, equality, and fraternity? And his answer, basically, across the 3 volumes of Capital, was the following. That what capitalism did would get rid of the preceding systems, master-slave, lord-serf. It presented itself as overcoming that kind of dichotomy in which a small number of people make all the decisions and insist that the system work first for them and only later for the others. What the master did to the slaves, what the lord did to the serfs. Capitalism presented itself, Marx said, as the breakaway from that, but it didn't. It just changed the form. Instead of getting rid of the dichotomy, it just replaced master and lord with employer, and slave and serf with employee. Therein lay the mistake. Because if you're going to overcome the inequalities, the injustices of systems that have a few people in a position of power and everybody else dependent on them, then you've got to break with this two-game, this two-poles system. You can't just change from one form to another, otherwise you're just changing the form of a continuing, oppressive, exploitative system. And Marx said that was the problem. And then to prefigure where we're going to go at the end of my talk, the only way to break out of what has been the legacy of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism is a system that does not have employers at one end and employees at the other, because it abolishes the dichotomy. All of the employees will be their own employers. What we would nowadays call a worker co-op. Then you don't have the dichotomy. Then there isn't a small group making the decisions and feathering its own nest at your expense. Let me give you a statistic or two, because it drives the point home, and it is what they taught me in school I should do at this point. So I'll start with Bill Gates. I have nothing against Bill Gates. I have never met Bill Gates. I hope that Bill Gates, if he's watching, doesn't take this personally. Bill is a fortunate man. He owns, according to the statistics, about $86 billion of wealth. It makes him, I believe, if I'm correct, the richest person on the planet. If you have $86 billion, I'm going to explain this to you on the assumption that most of you don't have the problem I'm about to describe. You do not manage all that money yourself because you don't know how, and you're smart enough not to do what you don't know how to do. So you give it to a group of people, typically called a hedge fund, and they manage the money for you. They take a hefty fee and a part of whatever they can get with your money, but they invest it for you. And these days, even with a so-so market, a hedge fund dealing with 86 billion would assure Mr. Gates that they would net at least 5% per year rate of return. They probably would get him better than that, but I'm going to be conservative because it's going to make my point. So I did, because we are trained in advanced courses how to do this, I figured out what 5% a year of 86 billion. This is a kind of problem an hour or two at home can solve. And here's what it works out to. Mr. Gates, through his hedge fund, earns about $80 million a week. Let me do that again. Mr. Gates currently earns $80 million a week. That's why he does not buy lottery tickets. Buying lottery tickets is something you do. He wins the lottery every week without buying a ticket. Buy a ticket every week and you never win the lottery. That's the difference between you and Mr. Gates. Capitalism is the system that produced Mr. Gates, something he would be the first to tell you. This is a system that puts in the hands of one person the receipt of $82 million a week, money that could be used to do an immense array of socially useful things that every one of you could write down on a list. They will not be done because you don't have any say over that money. None. Zero. And you never did, and you never will. He gets all that money. It's an amazing system. Oxfam, the biggest research entity in the world, based in London, that studies world inequality, pointed out in its annual report this year that the richest 80 people in the world have together more wealth than the bottom half of the population of the planet. That's 3.5 billion people. That's another achievement of capitalism. I could go on. You get the picture. You wonder why Marx looked around and said, let's see, equality didn't do so well. That's not equality, folks. That is grotesque inequality. That's an inequality, the parallels for which you'll have to go back to the ancient Greek or Roman or Egyptian pharaohs and kings to replicate. We've come all these thousands of years and we're back to that. If I had a moment, if I had more time, I'd stop now and play the national anthem. But I won't. But I won't. So Marx said, this system is the problem. And he said it in lots of complicated ways. But the problem is the employer-employee relationship. He summarized it in a little exercise. I'm going to indulge your patience for a moment. Here's the exercise, laid out in Volume 1 of Capital. When anyone goes for a job with a private employer, you sit down and you discuss the job you're looking for, and you go over the details, and then you get to that sensitive topic, how much am I going to get paid? And let's suppose you and the employer agree, $20 an hour you're going to get paid. You have to come at 8 o'clock the next Monday to Friday and do what you're asked to do. You do know how work works. You come into the workplace, you hang up your coat, and a person tells you what to do, how to do it, where to do it, with what equipment to do it, and what way on the machines, and then you do it this way, and then you do it that way. You don't spend more than 2 minutes peeing in the bathroom, etc., etc., etc. And at the end of the day, you leave all the things your brains and muscles help to produce, and you go home. And if you take any of the things you produced home with you, we send a man in dark blue uniform who hurts you. So that you remember tomorrow not to take anything except the stapler. Some of you take staplers. Some of you have many staplers in your home that you give away at Christmas time to people who then inform you that they have lots of Scotch tape. So in a modern capitalist system, Marx says, you take $20 an hour. And now Marx points out something that you all know, but don't want to face that there's only one reason on earth any employer will ever give you $20 for an hour of your labor. And that's if, in that hour, your labor adds more than $20 worth of output for him to sell. Because if he didn't do that, he would be making no money off of hiring you. And much as he loves you and your Uncle Harry, you're not going to get a job. In other words, the only way capitalism has ever worked is if the workers who work using their brains and muscles every day produce more for the employer than he pays for them. Now you know why at the end of most working days in your life you have had that vague feeling of being ripped off. Because you were. And that's why, of course, at the end of the workday, you stop by that special establishment on your way home which offered you something you badly needed to offset that feeling of being ripped off. The place that offered you a happy hour. Because it distinguished that hour from the previous ones you had just spent your life in. It's funny, but you are laughing at your own exploitation. Those of you, particularly the young ones here, who have said proudly to one another, I will never work for anyone who doesn't pay me what I'm worth. You don't understand the system, do you? That will never happen as long as capitalism is the way the system is set up, said Marx. And then he went on to spell it out. If that extra, what you produce beyond what you get paid, what the capitalist hires you for, that extra, that surplus, that profit, if that all accrues to the capitalist, well, then we can't be surprised if he takes it and he gives it to himself, which makes him richer. And you, not so much. There's your inequality. There's no mystery here. Inequality is a product of capitalism. It always has been. That has never stopped except in moments when the mass of people who couldn't stand it anymore rose up and said, no more of this. By the way, those of you who'd like documentation, because we are, after all, here at a college where you are taught to respect documentation. I'm trying to be polite. 3 years ago, a French economist named Thomas Piketty wrote a book. Some of you noticed it. It got a lot of attention. It was called Capital in the 21st Century. It's a 625-page book that documents country by country, era by era, how and why, theoretically and empirically, capitalism produces growing inequality. Go get it. It's in the library. It's a bit long, and writing is not his chief achievement, but the point is unmistakable and documented beyond all words. By the way, Mr. Piketty, together with a professor here in Berkeley named Emmanuel Saez, S-A-E-Z, maintained the best documented evidence about global inequality there is in the world. And they have a free website. Go find it. Piketty Saez, Saez Piketty, and there you will get all of this kind of documentation of a huge group of people doing this work all the time, half of them in Paris, half of them in Berkeley, and you're not that far from this kind of work. Okay, so let's proceed now with the argument. What did Marx say? You've got to get rid of this capitalist system. If you want liberty, equality, and fraternity, he assumed that his readers did, he certainly did, then you've got to recognize that capitalism is not the vehicle to it. It might be a vehicle toward it, but it's not enough. If you want to get that, you've got to recognize that capitalism got you part of the way there, but it's now an obstacle. It has gone from a means of social progress to a fetter on social progress. Famous argument he made. So you've got to change the production system. Get rid of the employer-employee. Make the production of goods and service a community affair, not divided capitalists versus workers, but a community of equals. He liked that word, community, with its root of commune. And so you could call what he was proposing communism. Why not? But it's communism understood as a change in the organization of goods and services. So people inspired by Marx, and a footnote here, because this too has to be reminded to an American audience that hasn't been able to study or understand any of this for so long. Marx dies in 1883. He writes these things that I'm summarizing to you in the 1860s and 70s. So Marx has really only been dead about 150 years, during which time his ideas have spread to every country on the face of this planet. In every country there are Marxist newspapers, Marxist journals, Marxist organizations, Marxist schools, Marxist political parties, and in many countries, little ones like China, Marxist governments. The history of the human race has very few parallels to anything like the spread of such ideas so fast and so far. Something this man was writing rang a bell for people in the most different cultures and moments of history. It's extraordinary. That's a testimony to the relevance of it all, and therefore a good reason for Americans to pay no attention at all. How did Marxists, who were becoming self-identified, followers of Marx, were the people who were critical of capitalism, who thought the human race could and should do better than that system? That employer-employee wasn't the end of history, wasn't the end of human progress, nothing close to it. A step forward, yes. The end? Oh no, stop. Not serious. So Marxists and socialists, by the way, you know why they called it socialism in those days? Because in capitalism, it's the capitalist who does everything for himself. He's not part of a community. He's an isolated, individual, self-interested turd. That was not a word Marx used. I learned that at Harvard. It seems to have an effect on audiences, as you can see. So people who were critical said, we're not in favor of a system that aggrandizes individuals who happen to be in this position. We prefer a system that is for everybody, a community system, a social system. That's where the word socialism comes from. Capitalism versus some kind of socialized production process, socialism. So starting in the second half of the 19th century, socialists, people influenced by Marx, persuaded by Marx, or persuaded by looking at the capitalism they lived in, maybe the novels of Dickens did more to shape people, or the novels of Émile Zola, if you like the French tradition, or Maxim Gorky, if you like the Russian tradition, and on and on and on. These people began to be numerous. They grew everywhere. Socialists. They began to form clubs and associations and political parties. And that meant they had debates. How are we going to get beyond capitalism, which is what we got, to this socialism, which we would prefer? Logical, how do we do that? And they came up with a plan that won pretty much, not everybody, but almost everybody's assent. Here's what we got to do. We have to capture the government. That's how we're going to do it. We're going to capture the government and then use the government that we've captured in order to move beyond capitalism and replace it with a socialism. What exactly the socialism was murky. There were debates, but it wasn't all that worked out. What was more clear in everyone's mind is that first part, grab the state. And the socialists fell into two great camps. One camp said the way you have to grab the state is revolution. You have to rise up. What was the model? The French Revolution. We have to do to capitalism what the capitalists did to feudalism. We should have a revolution. Others said, no, 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 not good, very dangerous, very bloody. We don't want it. We need to do it peacefully. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to use universal suffrage. We're going to use the fact that everybody votes. And we're going to win because the workers are the majority and the capitalists are the minority. It seems kind of clear. So let's do socialism that way. Peaceful socialism, non-revolutionary socialism, evolutionaries. There were various ways of articulating it, and that became the big debate. But notice both sides in the debate had a clear idea. Get the state. Take over the state, and that will allow us to do it. And socialists, therefore, became advocates of the state. The state should intervene. And that socialism, here we go now, folks. This is what Americans understand. Socialism is when the state does something. That's why you can travel across America and people will tell you, the socialism, we have socialism in America. And when you ask, really, I hadn't noticed. Yes, they say, the post office. It's the government. Welfare. It's the government. The government doing something became, as it still is, particularly in this country, socialism. But there's not a mystery. That's because the socialists themselves were complicit. They were focused on the state. And the state would take over and the state would make it good. The state would, and so you had, I'm condensing time here because I have a limited amount, fast forward to the Russian Revolution. A revolutionary upsurge, you displace capitalism, and what does it mean? The state comes in. The Bolsheviks seized the Russian state at a moment of its intense weakness. Russia had just lost World War I. That didn't make it popular. It was easy. And they did it, and they took the state. And then the state did what a socialist thought it should do. The state said to the private capitalist, you're gone. We're going to run the society. We're going to produce goods and services. And we're going to do it for everybody instead of you doing it for yourself and a few shareholders. And we're not going to let the market decide where things happen. That's going to be planned by the government. The government takes over production and the government takes over distribution by means of planning. And so for 100 years into the 20th century, the idea was capitalism is private enterprise and markets, and socialism is state enterprise and planning. Nice, neat, simple dichotomy. But notice something about that dichotomy. It doesn't say a word about the organization of production. The revolution in Russia comes and goes, and the workers go to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, exactly as they did before. The difference is instead of the board of directors being elected by the shareholders, as in a private corporation, the board of directors is now state officials sent down by the Communist Party. That's an interesting change, but it doesn't change the relationship between a few people who make all the decisions and the mass of people who don't. Once again, the human race thought it was overcoming what existed before, and all they had done is change the form. We're still left with the problem that if you want to overcome capitalism and all that it has produced, you have to bite the bullet. You have to change the organization of production. You've got to face the fact that we live in a system called capitalism that assigns to a tiny minority the decision-making power over the productive process, and to the vast majority the obligation to live with the results of what those few make as decisions, and to have no effective influence over those decisions at all. You live in that. That's what capitalism is. That's what it has always been. And you can change the form, but if you don't go at that key dimension, you're stuck with this system And whether it's public or private, it doesn't matter to what is at stake. That's the criticism of capitalism that comes from 150 years of self-reflection, of trial and error. We now know what the first experiments in going beyond capitalism produced. By first experiments, I mean Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, all of that. They were the first efforts to go beyond by self-conscious socialists. And like the first efforts to go beyond every system the world has ever seen, they weren't the last efforts. It turns out that the first efforts made mistakes. This should be as surprising as discovering tomorrow that there's sunshine. What did the Russians and the Chinese achieve by their going not beyond capitalism, but by replacing private capitalism with state capitalism? A capitalism in which the state is the few who make the decisions and the mass. What was achieved? What would be a balanced evaluation of what socialism achieved in its early experiments? Well, let's see. A balanced evaluation means it's looking for strengths and weaknesses. That's very different from the last 75 years in which we were satisfied with the weaknesses because we knew in advance there were no strengths. So let me remind you of the strengths. We'll start by going backwards in history. For the last 20 years, one country is listed every year by the United Nations as the country whose economy is growing the fastest, the country whose wealth is being increased by its working people faster than in any other country. I presume and hope you all know what the name of that country is. It's the People's Republic of China, an officially self-described socialist country. And before the Russians became number one, the previous 40 years, it was the Soviet Union. Last week, the Chinese announced their current rate of economic growth, 6.9%. That's 3 times faster than that of the United States this year. There is no contest between these two countries. Contest is over. We lost. The rest is fakery. A fakery that is the same refusal to face what's going on that I began this evening's talk with. And it comes from the same place. If you're a poor country, which is what most countries are, and you would like to do something about that, which most countries would, then the model presented by the Soviet Union and China is the model to follow. If what you're concerned about is personal freedom, if what you're concerned about is democratic political opportunity, not so much. They didn't do real well there. They gave the government so much power that the government went ahead and abused it in all kinds of ways that you've all heard about. Which means that those of us interested in going beyond capitalism, because the notion that we can't do better than that is literally too depressing to deal with, we then have to face the fact. We have to produce a critique of the early experiments because they did something, fast economic growth, but they did something else, too much power in the hand of the government. We want to build on what was achieved and avoid what went wrong. And how would you do that? The answer turns out to be, surprise, surprise, to go back to Marx and ask what was his point, being the great critic of capitalism that he was. And the great point was the issue isn't state versus private. You will search long and hard in Marx's work, for those of you that are interested, to see him writing great disquisitions on whether the state or the private sector should do something. He didn't care. That wasn't his issue. Socialism for him had nothing to do with what the government does or doesn't do. For him, socialism was changing the way we enter into the workplace every day of our adult lives. 5 out of 7 days, 9 to 5, the core of your adult life is spent at work. And everything he had to say was change the way you live and work in that time of your life, and that will change the world. Don't change it, and you'll be stuck in a system that is as unfair, unjust, unequal as capitalism has proved itself for 300 years to be. You don't have to agree with anything I'm saying. You really don't, obviously. But to imagine that these arguments I'm giving to you, and I'm just sketching them for you, are something you don't need to study, you don't need to think about, you don't need to read about, you don't need to have a teacher explore with you, that's beneath contempt. And a university system that does that doesn't deserve the respect many of you still give it. And if it doesn't do it in the university you attend, do something about that, because you're not getting the education you're overpaying for. Okay, what do we do about it? Are we lost? Are we stuck in a system? And the answer is no, because Marx does more than criticize capitalism. He points in a direction, and we can take that path some way further. So let's do that. What would it mean, finally, to overcome the dichotomy between master-slave, lord-serf, employer-employee? The answer is, and this is something Americans should welcome, we celebrate what I'm about to say, this word, almost every day: democracy. How about we democratize the economy? How about we democratize the enterprise? How about we democratize the workplace? And what would it mean? Nothing complicated, folks. One person, one vote at the workplace. All the people who come 9 to 5 to this store, to this office, to this factory, get together, and together they debate the alternatives, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits we make together. There it is. It's so simple that when you finally see it, you kind of wonder, how come we haven't been discussing this alternative all along? What was this taboo so powerful that not only could we not go in that direction, we couldn't even think about it, or talk about it, or debate it, or read about it, or study it, or anything. We had to pretend there was nothing there. Wow. Wow. And now it turns out, folks, that all over the world, including here in the United States, people have been building and setting up worker co-ops for a long time. Not only isn't this a big revolutionary idea, except in America, it's not a big revolutionary idea ever. It's thousands of years old. Collective decision-making about production is found all over the Native American population for millennia. It's there. We have a lot of good records about it. Some of you know that the slogan, "It takes a village to raise a child," was not invented by Hillary Clinton. As best I can tell, it comes from the Iroquois nation in the Northeast, who organized their child rearing in that way. Thousands of years old. I know it's in Spain, but I'm going to give you the example that all of you need to look at some point. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation of Spain. Organized by a Catholic priest in 1956 in the north of Spain. A worker co-op. One priest, 6 workers. Little town of Mondragon, the Pyrenees Mountains of northern Spain. Today, the Mondragon Corporation, Cooperative Corporation, has 100,000 workers. It's the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It is a worker cooperative, or rather, a family of about 200 worker cooperatives united under one corporate organization. All decisions are made by the workers in each of these co-ops collectively. One worker, one vote. Once a year, they have a meeting of all the workers where they decide what to do about any of the people they've hired as managers and supervisors. They decide whether to retain them or not. I guess I didn't get that across, so let me do that again. The workers hire the managers. We don't work that way. We work the other way round, but not in a co-op. They decided that the highest paid worker in a co-op gets cannot get more than 8.5 times what the lowest paid worker does. The ratio in this country between a CEO and the lowest paid worker in a large corporation is about 300 to 1. You want to do something about inequality? You don't need welfare. You don't need a government handout. You don't need endless struggles about who gets what in the redistribution of wealth. You won't have to redistribute the wealth if you don't distribute it unequally in the first place, you idiot. Here's a metaphor. You're a parent. You have 2 children. It's a nice day. You go out, and the man in the little ice cream truck comes by. And your children say, I want an ice cream. So you buy 2 ice creams and give them to one of the 2 children. Thereupon begins a struggle that will destroy any sibling relationship for the rest of their lives. Because you explain to the kid to whom you've given the 2 ice creams, it would be nice if you gave your brother or your sister one of them. Yeah, it might be nice, never gonna happen. But you can prevail, you can force a redistribution. Wouldn't it have been smarter to give each kid 1 cone at the same time? Would have avoided most of this. If we didn't distribute income so unequally, we wouldn't tear ourselves apart as a nation over how to redistribute it. And the way to organize an equal distribution, make it a democratic process. Because here's what I can assure you. If all the people working at a workplace together decided who got what, you wouldn't have one person with $86 billion and other people who couldn't send their kid to college. Wouldn't happen. So instead of 800 mechanisms of redistribution, none of which have worked, how about trying an equal distribution by means of a worker co-op? Let me give you another example. You could make more money in your company by closing the factory and moving to China. The capitalists say, hey, great, we can pay those Chinese workers a small fraction of what we pay American. We'll make a fortune. Now imagine the worker co-op making the decision. Let's see. Should we close down our business, lose our jobs, move to China, and everything in our lives destroyed and the community gone? Unlikely. You wouldn't have seen the movement of jobs out of this country the last 40 years. Businesses would have had to solve their problem some other way. And by the way, don't worry about this. We have been limiting how businesses can solve their problem throughout the history of capitalism. Every time we tried to limit capitalists, they told us that can't be, you have to, it couldn't work, we could never survive, you have to. Always, this turned out to be, and I'm going to use another technical term, bullshit. Let me give you examples. 100 years ago, we told businesses, you cannot hire children under 6 years of age, which they had specialized in doing. What do you mean? It's a terrible thing not to let us hire them. These are kids from poor families. Now they won't have a job. As if the employer gave a damn about those families. You're depriving poor families of a chance to send their 6-year-old into my sweatshop. The American people, to their credit, said, we don't care about any of this. You'll solve your problems another way, but you're not going to exploit 6-year-old children. Not again. It's over, Jack. And we survived, and so did the businesses. And now we've been telling them, you can't pollute the neighborhood you live in, and you can't sexually assault your workers, and you can't do all these things which you thought were necessary for your job. And if we tell them you can't leave the country, it's over. They can't. You know why they can't? Because they are few and we are many. And if we get a backbone, this reality will have all kinds of exciting effects that we ought to think about. Well, some of you might say, oh, it's a very nice idea. Maybe it's worked in a few places, but, can it work here in the United States? And the answer is, of course it can. And we know because it already has. A few hours north of here is something that some of you may have heard of called the Alvarado Street Bakery. Does any one of you have any idea? Okay. That's a worker co-op. Extraordinarily successful. At the latest numbers, I think it has over 100 workers there now, very successful, produces bread for a huge number of outlets, both in California and in neighboring states. It's been around for 25 years. It's a worker co-op. It's stunningly successful. The annual salary of those workers is higher than the median here in California. If you want to learn about a worker co-op right here in your own states, it's been real successful, try the Alvarado Street Bakery. I can give you examples across the country. I live in New York City. In the Bronx, we have the largest worker co-op in the United States. Over 2,200 immigrant Latina women, many of whom are undocumented, having a hard time getting jobs for all the reasons you know well here in California. They formed an office cleaning cooperative, and they have done very, very well. They've been going for a dozen years. They grew from 20 women to over 2,000 women. It's an extraordinary statement of success. Back to the Mondragon Corporation. They're so big, they're so large. They opened many years ago the Mondragon Corporation. The Mondragon University, 4 campuses in northern Spain, where they have been teaching courses for years on how to organize a co-op, how to finance a co-op, how to manage a co-op, how to deal with downturns in the business environment for a co-op, how to do the financing for a co-op. We don't have to reinvent the wheel just because we in America are 70 years behind the times thinking these questions through. Is Mondragon a socialist experiment? When you go there and visit them, which I urge you to do, because they love to show people around. They have tours. You just have to contact them in advance. Go there. It's an hour's drive beyond the French border if you come from the north. And they'll do it all in English, so those of you who don't speak Spanish, not a problem. All this work has been done. Why on earth would we stay with a capitalist system so unequal, so unjust, and before I leave with this, so unstable? I want to say a word about instability. Capitalism has an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. How do we know that? Because in the 300 years of history, that's what it's done. If you're convinced it won't happen in the future, that's very nice. I'm happy for you. But it has for 300 years, so the burden's a bit on you to make the argument. Wall Street is real worried these days. You know why? Because if 4 to 7 years is the amount of time for a downturn, and if the last downturn we had was in 2009, it's scary what the arithmetic suggests. Take a pad, work it out, you'll see what I mean. And people are indeed very worried, very worried. Since we're not really out of the crash of 2008, another downturn now would make the life of Mr. Trump even more complicated than it already is, which it clearly exceeds his comfort level. So, what about this instability? In 1929, capitalism had a global crash, the worst of its history. From 1929 to 1941, this economy basically collapsed and took much of the rest of the world with it. Unemployment in 1933 was 25%. That means every family in the United States had somebody unemployed who, because he or she wasn't working, meant they used up their savings. And when they used up their savings, they used up whatever else anybody else in the family had. We were told in the aftermath of that terrible, terrible crisis that the government and the leading businesses had learned how to manage an economy so it would never have that happen again. Every president since Franklin Roosevelt, who was president in the 1930s, has promised the American people that the downturn that occurred during their administration. And why did every president have to make a statement about the downturn that occurred in his administration? Because every president had a downturn in his administration. Because we live on an economic system that's a roller coaster. So each president said, if you do what I suggest, follow my policies, not only will I get us out of this downturn, but I'll make sure that we never have it again. Every president promised it. No president ever delivered on it. For those of you who've heard the following joke, I apologize. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. But you live in a system that is very unstable. And not only do you stay here, but many of you avoid the mental effort to figure out what you're doing and ask yourself why you're doing it when you don't have to. In 2008, we all learned that the lessons of the Great Depression hadn't been learned at all, or they didn't work, or both, because we had another doozy of a crash, which we're still in. We're still in it. The people who brought us the crash have recovered, and I'm happy for them. That's not really true. But for those who suffered the crash, they're still suffering. And even though we are a country with great skills at scapegoating folks who had nothing to do with it, immigrants, you know, Muslims, we're very clever at this. Whatever we do to those communities isn't going to solve the problems of a system that's unstable as capitalism has always been. It's been so frightening to the people who love capitalism, this horrible instability that plunges everybody into periodic bouts of unemployment, lost homes, and all the rest, that the profession I'm part of, the economics profession, has been single-mindedly devoted for 150 years to try to figure out a way to overcome, to stop this instability. One of the greatest thinkers in our profession, John Maynard Keynes, devoted his adult life and that of thousands of his followers, economists around the world, to understanding why this system is so unstable and what we need to do. And he came up with monetary policies and fiscal policies that we can use to prevent the thing, and it never, ever worked. But that does not dissuade my colleagues. Friends of mine like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz believe with a fervor that really develops in me the concept of economic fundamentalist, a belief that they'll figure it out, if not this year, then next year. They'll come up with a new model, econometric, behaviorist, all the latest buzzwords of economics, to figure out how to tame a system that always was out of control. They haven't done it to this point, and my advice to all of you is, don't hold your breath. The system is unstable, unequal, unjust, and undemocratic, and it always has been. And if you didn't figure it out, it's not your fault. You lived in a society which for 75 years pretended none of this was true, none of this was relevant, none of this was worth thinking about, debating, discussing, or admitting that any serious person anywhere had ever any reason to believe. It's really stunning. And in future generations, they'll look back on this period and shake their heads in disbelief at the self-delusion that a population could allow itself. Conclusion. Worker co-ops are a way to realize a slogan. The slogan goes like this: if you want an economy to serve the people, you've got to put the people in charge. And if you don't, it won't. And you can turn and twist and whistle and scream and yell, but you're not escaping this reality. If working people together collectively owned and operated their enterprises, that would be the productive wealth, the base of any government. Any government would have to get them willing to part with the resources paid as taxes to a government. Instead of a government serving the people who now have the resources, the capitalists, it would finally be the mass of the people who control the resources without which the government cannot function. You want democracy in a political system, you have to have it in the economic system. Otherwise, its absence in economics will make a mockery of what you have in politics. You ought to know that because you live in it. You know these things. Socialism in the 21st century will give to the government secondary functions of coordination, but the real political and economic power will rest at the level of the workplace that people gather and the residences in which they live. They will organize both of them democratically, and the two will collaborate in owning, running, and operating a modern society. That's a different system. That's a critique of capitalism, but that's a place for us to go. And as a person who is deeply influenced by Marxism, well, let me take a step back. Why not be daring? Of course I'm a Marxist. Not only am I a Marxist, I'm happy about it. I'm proud of it. I like it. And if anything I said to you today, this evening, if any of it's interesting, if any of it had a point, if somewhere along the way you thought the insight was valuable, don't credit me. It wasn't me. What you found interesting, don't tell your mother this, was Marx and Marx's insights and Marx's criticism, because that's what I use to pretend otherwise is not honest. And I don't have to be evasive around this because I'm no longer dependent on my old employer. And my new one, which is the New School University in New York City, was founded and organized, here it comes, by Marxists. They came, for those of you who don't know, they came from Germany, from a place called the Frankfurt Institute. Their names included people like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Walter Benjamin. Some of these names, hopefully many of you know of. Those who escaped the Nazis came to the United States and set up a new university, a new school, so they could continue doing, oh boy, their Marxist research here because they couldn't continue in fascist Germany. Imagine how sad they were when shortly after the war, what they had run away from Germany to escape followed them here. And they couldn't do it here anymore. Socialism is not dead, folks. And the reason it's not dead is the same reason that Marxism isn't dead. Socialism is capitalism's shadow. Try losing your shadow when the sun is up. Very hard to do. Socialism is the critique of capitalism, the desperate desire, the yearning to do better. It's the most positive thing capitalism ever produced. Parents who understand their children see in their children the effort to learn from the parents, to do better when it's their turn to be parents. Come on. Capitalism is not the end, and socialism isn't over, because capitalism is the best guarantee that socialism is right there, just around the corner. Marxism is never provoked so much as by capitalism. Across Europe, Marx's work is now in many countries, Germany included, a bestseller. You know why? Because the collapse of capitalism in 2008 made an entire generation of people begin to wonder about a system that works this way. Just like millions of Americans are now beginning, particularly young people, to wonder, what does it mean that I have gone into debt I cannot afford to get a bachelor's degree that's less useful for getting a job than it's ever been? I'm paying more for less. That's what capitalism offers me. There must be a better way. There is. The worker co-op is a radical new way to organize production that points to economic and political changes that are much more in line with liberty, equality, and fraternity than anything we have now. I hate to paraphrase Donald Trump, but when he said, "Why don't you vote for me? What have you got to lose?" He knew that by then that the American people had figured out that voting for Bush or Clinton wasn't attractive. That was a clever argument. So I'm going to make it too. Building a sector of worker co-ops in America, a major part of our economy, so that we can compare as a people, worker co-ops, to capitalist, undemocratic institutions. Let the people decide who are looking for a job. You want to work in a top-down hierarchy, or do you want to work in a democratic workplace? Do you want to buy your goods from a capitalist factory or from a Democrat? Do you want to vote for the one or the other? Come on, let's have a sector, let's produce it, let's let the people see and decide between them. If you're so confident of capitalism's superiority, let's see how long you'll keep that glib attitude if you actually gave the alternative a chance. And here's my closing argument. If what I've just said means anything to you, you might be surprised to know that there is a political party in a place that might surprise you that has already committed itself to building a large worker co-op sector of its hitherto capitalist economy. And when I tell you where it is, you'll understand that there is a symmetry to history after all. Because the country that's about to leave capitalism in this way is the country in which capitalism began. Britain. What? Yeah, Britain. That cold, wet, offshore island near Europe. Jeremy Corbyn is the head of the Labour Party now. He's sort of the Bernie Sanders of Britain. But the difference is Bernie lost and Corbyn won. He's the head of the British Labour Party now. And he has promised that if the Labour Party wins the next election, which admittedly is a long shot given the polls, but nonetheless a possibility, the Labour Party is the number 2 party in England, roughly like the Democrats relative to the Republicans. Here's the official policy of the Labour Party. If we win, we will pass a law, and the law will read as follows. Every British enterprise, any office, any store, any factory, any enterprise, can continue as it is for as long as it wishes. But if and when any British enterprise decides either to close, stop functioning, or to sell out to another company, to sell itself to another corporation, or to become a public company, that is to sell shares of stock and become a listed economy. Whenever a company comes to any of those options, it will be forbidden to do it unless it first gives its own workers what's called a right of first refusal to buy the company from the owners and convert it into a worker co-op. That will be the law in Great Britain. And that ought to raise in your mind this question. Okay, very nice, but where will the workers get the money to buy the company that the employer must offer to sell them? At that point, Mr. McDonald, who is the financial shadow cabinet of the Labor Party, that's the person who would be the chief finance, he smiles, looks directly into the television camera, and says, of course we have that taken care of. The government will lend them the money. This is a government committed to transform a major part of British industry from capitalist to worker co-op. I'm not discussing something that's a vague idea or a future utopia or an unworkable. This is something that very smart people of all sorts have figured out is the only way out of the capitalist disaster in which we are living. Socialism for the 21st century is going to surprise us. It's going to be about a massive movement. It's going to be about a strategy, a vision of where to go, a real alternative to struggle for. It's a way out. And as we live in an America that is increasingly clearly upset about where things are, we just voted for somebody that proves we are very upset about where things are as a nation. What's going to be needed is a way out, a way forward. Socialism has found a new way to present itself as the alternative, which it always tried to be. It made some big mistakes. It learned from those mistakes to try to avoid them and to try in a serious way to set up a way forward that gets the benefits that socialism has always represented without the detours, the bad and dangerous detours it suffered and that it imposed on the world. That's all you can ask for a tradition, to be that self-critical. I'm still waiting for those who are devotees of capitalism to match that self-criticism or that level of self-criticism. I'm proud of what I've learned from Marxism because I was able to make the kind of presentation tonight I just did. And if you found even a small part of it interesting, then you have become complicit in Marxism too. And I promise not to tell your mother. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is the section of the program where we'll be taking a few questions. Okay, so the question is, how did Berlin effectively push back gentrification efforts?
Okay, the pushback in Germany comes, of course, as all such pushbacks do, from below. Even when a politician steps forward and champions it, it's because of the pressure from below. And it came particularly from people who are being pushed out of their neighborhoods, as it normally does. And who are those people? The people who cannot afford the rising rents or home prices that wealthy people moving in are able to offer. Now, let me explain what's at stake here, because it is a classical Marxist issue. Gentrification is a fancy name for the normal workings of the market, that institution which Americans are taught to revere. A market, remember what a market does. A market distributes scarce commodities to the people who offer the most to pay for it. That's how the textbooks define it. That's how professors of economics like me are required to teach it. That's what a market does. If there's not enough ice cream cones, and there's too many of us who want the ice cream cone, then those of us who have money say, how much is it? $2. We say, well, I'll offer 3. If everybody else does, I offer 4. Eventually, the price will go to the point where other people can't afford it, and at that point, at $8.50 a cone, I smile because I get the ice cream, you get nothing. That's what gentrification is. The people with more money come in, bid up the price of the apartment or the home or the land or whatever it is until other people can't afford to stay there. They are pushed out, and you get a homogeneous community where homogeneous means money. That's how markets work. They do not ask how you got the money. They do not ask what the consequences will be of having all these people leave and all these other people come in. Those are not allowed in markets, those questions. It's just a question of who's got the money. You have money, you get it. You don't have money, you don't get it. I don't know how many of you take seriously your Christian or other ethical or moral commitments. But whatever they are, they don't square with markets, which is a troubling thought if you actually take it seriously. Do you really want the community's scarce housing to go with only the money? During warfare, this system works as follows. In a war, we use a lot of our resources to fight, to equip soldiers, to make bullets, to all of that. And that means we don't have many resources left for civilian goods, which means civilian goods become scarce. Civilian goods, you know, bread, milk, gasoline, coffee, those kinds of things. And now we have a choice, don't we? We can let the market decide, in which case these scarce goods will go to the rich people. The problem is, if you're fighting a war, that's too risky. Because in a war, you need everybody to be ready to fight. And you're not going to make them ready if all the people who don't have money are screwed out of their coffee in the morning. They're going to be irritated. So you better not do that. You better not what? You better not let the market distribute things. In World War II, we were fighting a war. We used our resources for killing people. There wasn't much left for civilian goods. Did the United States let the market decide? No. For those of you who've never heard this history, that's a sign that you didn't get good education in your schools. We had a rationing system. The government handed out ration cards to all Americans to enable them to get coffee, sugar, gasoline, milk, meat, a lot of things. Didn't matter how much money you had. You didn't get a ration card, you didn't get it. And this is now, for those of you that are already half complicit Marxists, here comes a shock. How did the government decide how to distribute the ration cards? Here was the rule: to each according to their need. You know where that phrase comes from? Karl Marx. The American government used the system of Karl Marx. But luckily it was America, and the people who invented it and applied it hadn't a clue what they were doing. There are the benefits of not knowing what's going on. So we didn't let the market work. So here's the final answer. Why in the world would you allow the distribution of people in a community to be organized by the market? That makes the community completely minus diversity, minus the diversity of rich and poor. That's nuts. That's not the way you want to organize a community. We know that in America. New York City, I don't know Los Angeles, but in New York City, here's how it works. You have a lovely, interesting, diverse community. It's got poor people and rich people and artists and students, and it's lively and lots of little shops. It's so exciting that lots of rich people want to live there. And they come and they tear down the old houses, they build the new houses, and they get rid of all those interesting people, and it becomes the most boring, dead, high-rise disaster from which rich people then look to escape. That's called the irrationality of capitalism. So the way you fight gentrification is to understand This is not something that is handled well by a market, and therefore it shouldn't be. For those of you for whom it's a new idea not to use markets, I recommend you take a look at the writings of two old men. One is called Aristotle, and the other one, Plato. They discussed markets. And when they discussed markets, they had one thing they agreed, that as institutions for distributing things, markets, I'm going to use their terms, suck. Okay? That was a joke. They didn't say that. Or at least I don't read the Greek, so maybe they did, but they couldn't translate it. Plato and Aristotle, the people we say were the founders of Western civilization, thought ill of markets. They didn't believe in them, they criticized them, they attacked them. So it's not so daring as you might imagine to say where people live, what kind of communities we might be based on some of us are artists and some of us are workers and some of us are creative in this way and then some of us have children and some of us don't. And so it might be interesting to make a diverse community that we could design maybe even in a democratic way. But we don't do that. We let it be decided that the community is composed of the people with the money. It is, to use a technical term, disgusting. Okay, I'll be briefer.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for coming out. Okay, can you hear me? Hear better?
He's got to hear you.
Okay. Standing here, I realize why, for maybe the last few years, I always listen to your economics updates program, because it seems to just now that it's filling in all of the holes in my crappy UCLA economics education that I got. So the reason I drove 4 hours to get here to listen to you tonight is to ask this one question. Now, you always have Ellen Brown espousing the virtues of public banking.
Right.
And it's been occurring to me that with all the benefits it has, for example, the funds could be used to organize worker co-ops or solar villages or whatever at very low interest rates and all that sort of thing, and keep the interest rates and fees inside of the state and not going out. However, our movement, I've observed in 50 years or whatever, operates in dribs and drabs. It's like herding cats. And I was just wondering if you have seen the possibility of, rather than each of us in our individual states or localities trying to bring up a public bank infrastructure, if all of us could instead focus our attention on the lowest hanging fruit. So let's say, for example, Vermont State, and focus all of our efforts there, get the public bank going there, let it learn from the lessons of North Dakota, which is our foot in the door, so it's really hard for them to close that door on us now, and then use that as an example to start that domino game falling. And I think it's just for us to play the game, and the game is there for us to play. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I have one. So first of all, thank you for driving 4 hours. I'm not sure I would have done that, but I hope you don't feel it was a waste of effort. I love the question because this is a man who is struggling to find tactics. He gets it. He understands it. He's with it. He's trying to figure out, maybe if we all concentrated on Vermont, we could get another foot in the door. It's a good idea. Let's try that. Come on, let's try lots of things. Yes. That's how we're going to figure out which one works. I don't know what the best tactic is. And if I were to stand here and tell you this is the best tactic, you shouldn't listen to me. We don't know that. We're not there quite yet. We're beginning. We're beginning. I work with this organization called Democracy at Work. If any of you are interested, you saw the young people that are here in LA working on it. We have that now growing all over the country. Why? Because there are enough people who understand what's going on that they've moved on to the next stage. They want to do something, and they're prepared to spend their time and their energy, without which we're not going to get change, doing it. But the exact specific things, this is as good a place to start with this gentleman's idea as any I've heard. So let's focus on one state. I would want you to be daring. So let me add one thing. Over the last 4 years, the largest private banks in the United States, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, you know them, the 7 or 8 monster banks that are everywhere, have been found guilty by courts, by regulatory agencies, of illegal, unethical activities. They manipulated the interest rates around the world, the LIBOR scandal. They were caught manipulating foreign exchange markets. They ripped us off during the mortgage crisis of 2008. They overcharged us for not having enough funds to cover our checks on a regular basis. Literally everything that those big banks do, they did to screw the mass of people illegally or unethically. In any other rational society, this kind of dereliction of duty by private banks would have led there to be at least a national debate. Why do we permit something as important as the money we all depend on to be in the hands of people who have demonstrated their abuse of that situation? Therefore, to question, should we have public banking? Like we have public parks and a public police department and a public fire department, because we need those things collectively, and we don't want to put the fire department in the hands of a private company whose first loyalty is to making money off the fire department, in which they gather people to observe your house burning down, charging tickets for the show, right? We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. So we live in a society that can watch that behavior. They get fines that are mostly trivial, and they continue to be in a position to do exactly the same. So in addition to his tactic about Vermont, which is a good one, how about an attack on the sanctity of private banking when they have violated every commitment they ought to have made to decent behavior? It's long overdue.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. Mr. Wolff, thank you for coming out tonight. There's a narrative that's kind of put forth that I hear often at Davos and the World Economic Forum that goes something by academic economists that global capitalism, free markets, economic interdependence has led to 600 million less people in poverty, less chance of global conflict, and that's because inequality between nations has been being reduced, even though within nations it's being increased. So now that we live in a multipolar world, there's less of a chance of a world war, and there are a lot of people that are benefiting from increased opportunity they didn't have, though many people in the developed world have suffered because of that. So I just wanted to get your take on that, because that's the common narrative I often hear.
Yeah, that is a... We're going to go 3 questions. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes it's hard for people to understand how we can make that transition. You have a wonderful one about Italy. Italy we laugh at because they have so many different governments, but one thing they do is when progressives are in charge, they pass a good law. And that good law is the one that I'd like you to mention to the people, because it works so beautifully. Thank you.
And how do we, while we're striving to democratize the means of production, how do we keep certain elements of the political class from selling off the commons, or what little of them we have left, maybe especially our water?
Okay, the young man who asked about the narrative is quite right. Inequality among nations has lessened, whereas inequality within nations has gotten worse. But the problem with that statistic, like all statistics of that sort, is kind of what happens when you disaggregate, when you look behind the statistic to what is underneath it. So, for example, the major reason that there's less inequality in the world among nations is summarized in the word China. China's explosive growth in the last 25 years has taken one of the world's poorest countries and lifted them up to one of the world's better off countries. Just to drive it home for you, over the last 15 years, average wages of Chinese workers have gone up six to seven times. Over the same period of time, average wages in the United States have been flat. So let me say this again. The average Chinese worker has seen his wages go up 6 to 7 times, whereas the American worker has seen his wages go absolutely nowhere. If you don't understand what I just said, you will not understand world politics, because they're driven by such realities, because they're so stark. So yes, when you look at China, then you understand that statistic. But meanwhile, the inequality inside every country in the world, including China, has gotten much worse. China is now the number 2 country for millionaires in the world after the United States. Even though it's a much poorer country still than the United States, it has a disproportionate number of millionaires. That's a level of inequality which the Chinese themselves know is unsustainable in their society. Number 2, the law in Italy that was referred to by the question is called the Marcora law, M-A-R-C-O-R-A, the name of the Italian legislator who got it through. Here's a very simple rendition. If you become unemployed in Italy, you have 2 choices. You either take a weekly unemployment check, the way we have in this country, more or less, a year, year and a half, something like that. But you have a second option, which we don't have in the United States. If you get at least 9 other Italian unemployed workers like yourself to agree to work with you, you can go to the government and you can get, instead of a weekly check, you get your entire year or year and a half's worth of unemployment checks as a lump sum payment to you right now, on condition that all 10 of you, 10 or more, all 10 of you use that lump sum to set up a worker cooperative amongst yourselves. That's one of the reasons Italy has more worker co-ops. Now, many of the worker co-ops they've set up are not exactly worker co-ops. When you look at them a little more closely, you have to be careful about. Again, it's a statistical mirage in part, but nonetheless, the Marcora law, passed in 1985, repealed, qualified or changed, but never repealed since, despite the efforts of Italian business, is an interesting example. So is the reality that in the United States Congress, nobody has ever proposed an equivalent of the Marcora law, nor has it been debated or discussed. We pretend, like we do with so many things, that what we don't like isn't there, until someone explains to us it is, and then we feel awkward and a little backward. That's not my problem. Yes, how do we prevent the selling off of the commons? I have no idea. Selling off of the commons is a problem. Politics in capitalist societies are a very weird affair. That's true independent of the current extreme weirdness. Here's the weirdness. A politician in a capitalist economy is always caught. He or she is asked by corporations and the rich, please do the following things for us, but we don't want to pay any taxes. The same politician is confronted by the mass of people. Please do the following things for us, but we don't want to pay any taxes. For a corporation to do what the people want or what the rich want without raising taxes is not a feasible arrangement. So what's the politician has a choice. He can take money from one side and help the other, but that makes him enemies, whichever way he goes. So politicians have come up with an interesting plan. They can provide what people and corporations want without taxing them. You know the 2 ways. The 3 way. 1 way, run the printing presses. Print the money and spend it until everything falls apart. This has had unfortunate consequences in the past. The last time in Western societies was in the 1920s when the German government did that, and in a matter of 12 months, you went from 4 German marks to $1 to 6 billion German marks to the dollar. This, by the way, is an inflation. People were paid in bags of money. People at lunchtime. Because if you did not get your money at lunchtime and spend it by 1 o'clock, by the end of the day, it was worthless. The prices had doubled usually every 20 minutes. Okay? Of course, these things could never happen here. None of these awful things ever happen here. They only happen elsewhere. If you can't print money, here's a second way. You can sell off whatever the government has. A public park, some wetlands, some wastelands, some western lands, whatever you got, sell it. The Greek government currently is being required by the Europeans to sell everything. The water, the Parthenon, by the way, is going to become a McDonald's. You're going to be able to look through the remaining pillars at an enormous hamburger, and the world, no, I'm kidding. And the third thing a politician can do if he wants to have money to pay for the things people want without taxing them is to borrow the money. And that's why governments around the world are floating in vast amounts of debt. Not because you have to do it that way, but because the peculiar nature of how capitalism works puts corporations and the rich in the position of saying, you dare not tax me, because if you do, I'll fund your opponent and you won't win any election. And the mass of people say, if you tax me, I won't vote for you, and then you will win. So he can't. So he borrows, which, by the way, is particularly good for the rich, since when a government borrows, it can't borrow from the mass of people for the simple fact they don't have any money. So when a government borrows, it's basically borrowing from corporations and the rich, which from their point of view means that in modern capitalism, you can avoid being taxed by having the government that didn't tax you borrow the money from you instead and pay you interest for the privilege of not taxing you. If you understand that, you understand high finance. You also understand that you are being screwed. That's why this situation exists, and that's why they will sell off public lands.
Okay, here's the next set of 3 questions. I'm going to hold this right to your mouth.
Next question is, how do we square the demand of all these workers, especially they love to have 6% growth, with the environment? Someone has said that only a fool or an economist would believe in infinite growth in a finite system. We have a finite system.
Okay.
Good.
Take the next question.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the examples of hope in the UK with the Labour government and the proposal that they're making, and the other gentleman that mentioned the law in Italy. I wanted to raise a third one and ask your opinion about it, and again, this is an example of where the role of the state can play a big role, and that is in Cuba today, where the Communist Party is leading an initiative to help workers set up cooperatives all over the country.
I'm one of your students from the Brecht Forum and Judson Memorial, and I'm a libertarian communist. I'm of the strain of the Paul Matic group and workers' councils. But I have a question about American exceptionalism. By the way, I was just in China a year ago, and the workers don't run China. Right. You know, and there's landless peasants in the millions, anyway, who are barely making it. But anyway, my question is about American exceptionalism. I think one of the narratives in Marx is that the workers our class of ignoramuses will become not just a class in itself, but a class for itself through struggle, through, organizing. But in the United States, it seems like it's defied that narrative. And I guess maybe that's my question. I mean, what has happened to our class that we're actually voting in people, or a sector at least of the class, maybe the white working classes, voted in people like the current so-called president. Okay. Great to see you too.
Right. Okay.
So you going to answer these?
Yes.
After this lady here, we're not taking any more because we've got to get to the books. Okay.
Okay. The growth versus the finiteness of our planet and of the climate. Growth has been the plan for the defenders of capitalism from day one. Remember the inequality I talked about. The obvious way to adjust the inequality is to take things from the people who have a lot and give it to the people who don't. This is obvious. This is obvious to the people who don't have, and it's also, unfortunately, obvious to the people who do. Therefore, they've got to come up with some way to equalize, or at least to pretend to be interested in equalizing, that doesn't involve taking from them and giving to everybody else. The solution has been growth. You see, the idea is this way. If the pie gets bigger, then everybody's piece gets bigger. So you can keep the masses happy by giving them a growing piece, but it won't be at your expense because the whole pie gets bigger. Or if you want to push the metaphor, as the pie gets bigger, you can give more and more to the masses that's growing without having to take anything from the people who already have. That's the key idea. Growth is a substitute for taking from those who have. So capitalism has always celebrated growth. You're successful if you're growing. You're healthy if you're growing. It's a fetishism of growth. But there's no mystery about it because growth is the alternative to the clash that will take from the rich and give to everybody else. The poor capitalists today are stuck because this fetishization of growth is killing us in terms of the environment. But if we stop growing, we have no solution to the inequality. We're stuck in a system that is going to destroy us one way or the other. That's why I'm telling you about capitalism, and let me be clear in case I've been too subtle here. So let me be blunt. But I mean this, and it's serious. It's over. It's over. That's very hard. I know that. I am serious now. This system cannot solve its problems. It tries it this way and hits that obstacle. It adjusts and goes that way and hits another. That's the game. And they're running out of options. And people are getting angrier and bitterer and more disappointed, and they still can't find a way out. That's a time when a system begins to crumble. And the question for most of us, if we're honest, this system is going down. And are we going to go down with it? All right, the second, Cuba, very important issue. The Cuban government, which is run by the Cuban Communist Party, made a decision some years ago that their plan of having the government own and operate businesses and government planning to distribute, what some have called the Soviet model or the Chinese model, wasn't working for them for a variety of reasons that I can't go into now. But they made a very important decision, and the question was correct. The Cuban government has now switched its strategic focus away from government enterprise to creating worker co-ops. It's the very thing that I was talking to you about a few minutes ago. It is another example, this time in a socialist country, of a fundamental change of orientation. They who worked solidly for a long time in the face of unbelievable danger from the United States to build an economy around the government playing the key role, as was dictated by what socialism was understood to be in the 19th and 20th centuries, as I told you, came to the conclusion that that's not the way for the future in this country. Even before Fidel died, they made the decision with his approval to change direction and build around private worker co-ops that would not be government enterprises, that would be owned and operated by collectives of workers, and they've been doing that now for quite some time. There's a very famous woman economist named Marta Honecker who has written books and articles about that. There's a growing literature about this example. For those of you that are interested in Latin America, where a great deal of this is going on, take a look, if you can find it, of a film made by Naomi Klein and her husband called The Take. If you can find this film, look at it, find it on the It's a study of the takeover by workers in Argentina. When the capitalists abandoned their factories, the workers took them over and ran them for years and are still fighting the battle to hold on to them. Okay, the last question was about American exceptionalism. Why have Americans not changed the situation? Well, this is our history. At the end of World War II, something fundamental happened in the United States, which is a kind of collective trauma. There's no other way to describe it. You need the terms of psychology. In the 1930s, we had a collapse. In the midst of that collapse, the American people reacted very differently from the way they did in the collapse of 2008. In the 1930s, Americans joined labor unions to survive the Depression. Millions of people joined the CIO. People who had never been in a union before, who came from families where nobody had ever been in a union. They joined the unions by the millions, the greatest union drive in American history. We've never had anything like it before. We've never had anything like it since. Millions and millions joined unions. 500,000 people joined 2 socialist and 1 communist party. That had never happened before either. A fantastic growth of the left, and they worked together. The communists and the socialists were the advance guard. Oh, you might even call them the vanguard of the labor movement. The vanguard of the labor movement, because they helped organize people into the CIO. And they went to Roosevelt and they said to Mr. Roosevelt, I've told this story, but you can't tell it too often to American audiences. They went to Roosevelt and they basically threatened him. Mr. President, you've got to do something for the mass of people in the depths of this depression. Because if you don't, we won't vote for you. And if we don't vote for you, you won't be president very long. Because we're the mass base of the Democratic Party. And they had millions of people well organized by socialists, communists, and the labor movement, led by John L. Lewis, the head of the mine workers union here in the United States. And Roosevelt was a smart politician and understood they were not bluffing. He went back to the corporations and the rich, people he knew well, being one of them, and he said, hey, I just had a meeting with the socialists, the communists, and the unions, and they mean business. They told me I've got to take care of the mass of people. And they told me if I didn't, I wouldn't be president. And they hinted that if we didn't, you wouldn't have any money, gentlemen, because they take it from you in a revolution, just like in Russia. Remember, Russia wasn't that old at that time, the Soviet Union. They were very afraid. Franklin Roosevelt didn't convince them all. He convinced about half of them that it was safer for them to come to some deal with these people than it was to try to crush them. One half of the capitalist class didn't go with Roosevelt at all. Those are the forerunners of the Koch brothers. That's it. Really are the same people, by the way. But the half that Roosevelt had was enough. He went back to the unions and the communists and the socialists, and he said, okay, I got a deal. The government has no money. It's the Great Depression. Nobody's working. Nobody's paying taxes. The government has no money, which Roosevelt explained to those capitalists. If I'm going to take care of the mass of people, you're going to give me the money to do it. Because I don't have any money. The government has no money. But he said to them, I advise you to do it. You give me some of your money, I can take care of those people. You don't give me some of your money, you won't have any money at all. Because they'll take it from you. He scared them. But it was a scare. He was half scared himself. So he went to the communists and the socialists and the union and he said, I'm going to take care of you better than you thought I would. But you got to stop all that talk about revolution. That's got to stop. Otherwise, we got no deal. The communists and the socialists, with some exceptions, bought the deal. And he went on the radio and he said, I'm going to create the Social Security system. I'm going to give every American 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their life. We never had that before in the United States. As soon as he was done with that, he created the unemployment compensation system. You get unemployed through no fault of your own, you get a check for a year and a quarter every week. We never had that before either. Then he passed a minimum wage, the first time we had that in the country. He passed a law allowing unions to form and organize at the workplace. And then he created the public employment. Between 1934 and 41, the United States government hired 15 million people and paid them a wage. Where did all the money come from with a government that had no money to pay these enormous bills? He taxed corporations and the rich. I got to do that again. He taxed corporations and the rich. And he taxed them heavily, very heavily. What happened to a politician who dared to tax corporations and the rich, to help average Americans with Social Security, unemployment, minimum wage, and a government job. Was he destroyed? Was his career over? What every politician fears? No. Roosevelt was the most popular president in America. He was elected 4 times. No president had ever come close to that. It turns out if you tax corporations and the rich, you are the greatest hero the country produced. Poor Mr. Obama. He might have tried that angle. He might have gone that way. Maybe he was afraid that it would be difficult, which of course it would have been. But he might have ended up in a very different place historically and even for himself had he dared to follow the model. And you can see, if you listen closely to Bernie Sanders, he basically says that's what he's going to do. Doesn't mean he can and it doesn't mean he will, but it is interesting that he says it. Anyway, when the war was over, 1945, Roosevelt is dead. The war is over, the Depression is behind us. The capitalist class, taxed up the wazoo, angry, bitter, decides it has got to make sure to undo the New Deal, to undo what was done by the coalition of unions, socialists, and communists through Roosevelt to them. And so they went after it. This is your background, whether you understand it or not. And first they went at the weakest link of that coalition. That was the Communist Party. And instead of the communists being the vanguard that had organized the masses, which is mostly what they had done, they became the evil agents of a foreign power. Rev up the scary music. And we arrested them and we deported them and we terrified the country. You have anything to do with communism? That's where we began tonight's talk, right? You have to worry about your job and worry about your situation and worry about what your kids might say in school and 100 other things. And when it was finished with destroying the communists, it went after the socialists. And Americans were taught by the government throughout the late 40s and throughout the 50s, socialists are just like the communists. They just spell it differently. That's why Americans, unlike people anywhere in the world, when you discuss with Americans, what's the difference between a socialist and a communist, they haven't a clue. They really believe it's just a question of how you spell it. I used to think when I was a teacher and I discovered this, and then I further discovered that the students thought that socialist, communist, Marxist, anarchist are all synonyms. In parts of the country, you can stretch it out. Liberal gets included, and nowadays, of course, Muslims. What? But this is not stupidity. Not at all. It is the result of a campaign of terrorization of a population. To this day, Americans are drawn by a leaflet to come to a meeting about some social protest, and something inside you says, don't do that. Don't go there. Something undefinable bad will happen to you, and you probably should rather go and have another pizza. Because even though you don't know exactly why, it's sort of an interesting leaflet. And that was a nice young man or nice young woman who handed it to you. And you do care about this issue, but somehow you remember over a vague, distant dinner meeting at your house that people were scared of all of it. This is all bad. That runs very deep in the American population. Doing anything collective is a trauma here, and to do something explicitly critical of society, social change organized, we are coming out of a half century of taboo and of the hibernation of an instinct to change the world. It takes a long time to overcome a trauma. Ask any therapist. And the one thing that makes any trauma worse is not being able to talk about it with anybody. We're just beginning to be able to talk, which is one of the reasons I make this such a big part of my talks as often as I can, that we begin to talk about it, because that's the only way to get beyond this, so we can begin once again to see the beauty and the solidarity of working together to make social change, which is one of the ways you can do things that make your life better. It's a sad loss for each of you not to have that as part of your life. If you did, you would have the same nostalgic remembrance that I encounter in old men who remember their days in the army, when they had a kind of solidarity in their little platoon, in their little group, where everybody had everybody's back, and everybody, whether or not they were in combat, that they had a kind of solidarity they never again enjoyed, and they look back wistfully on it. You have a movement that you're part of, it's very similar. You don't have that in your life, the society loses, but so do you.
Okay. Last three. Quick, please.
The corporations that are making profit turning our public schools into charter schools, do you suppose that they're like Pinocchio doing the breaststroke in Satan's septic tank?
Okay. Go ahead.
It seems like there's two levels of problems that we have. There's the capitalistic problem, and then there's the central banking problem, which seems like the elephant in the living room. 21 years ago, I read, actually I heard him speak in Mexico, Ed Griffin, writer, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Have you?
Right.
Yeah. If you have a currency based on debt, even if you have the best system, co-ops, it can't sustain itself. We have a $20 trillion debt, $17 trillion GDP. I mean, the math just doesn't work. I mean, the scripts worked well in the colonies. You had the Confederate notes. You had the greenbacks. You had the U.S. notes. They all worked fine. And then, they got rid of Lincoln and then Kennedy, and we're back in the same mess. And then, like, the last three countries that are on the list are North Korea, Cuba, and Iran, right? That aren't Western controlled. So this seems like a cancer on Earth other than the capitalistic. So how do we address that issue? Thank you.
Yes. Good evening. I just want to say that, first of all, I'm honored to be in your presence. I thank you for being here. And my friend and my friend Karen were Bernie Sanders delegates to the Democratic Convention. And so we went through that. And when we came back after everything we'd been through, I converted to the Green Party, and then she's still trying to reform the Dems. But my question is, relative to trying to reform, overtake capitalism, where does the duopoly? I call them the corporate, because the corporate duopoly, they're one and the same. They are really the captains of the ship, and there's no one that's going to be able to, at least so far, that's going to be able to reform either party. And on another note, I just want to say that in 2006, we had 500,000 people in downtown Los Angeles for the May Day March. And because our undocumented and our Muslim brothers and sisters and our LGBTQ and every disenfranchised population is at risk, we're expecting 1 million people this year. So I have flyers for that, and I hope you'll all be there in downtown LA.
All right. Charter schools. What a wonderful topic. It's sort of the dream achievement of the Republican Party. They have a strategy. You starve public institutions of the money necessary to run them. After you starve them long enough, the mass of people become disgusted because they cannot perform the function you've denied them the money they need to do it. Then you turn the people's anger at the poor performance of those institutions against the institutions to justify not giving them any money, which makes the situation, this is a spiral. And as people become more and more desperate because the public institution doesn't work, they look for an alternative, and you arrive with the charter school. The charter school, again, introduces the market. Charter schools can charge money, in various ways, direct and indirect, and once again, money will allow you then to get to the school you want. It's the market solution, which gives to the people who have and denies the people who don't. To them that have shall be given, and from those who do not have, yea, even from them something will be taken. That's a paraphrase from the Bible. Charter schools, therefore, are an immense fraud. Remember what public education was supposed to be. It was supposed to be to bring people together who were otherwise divided in the community by issues of race or ethnicity or income or education, to give everybody a kind of level playing field chance to develop their skills, to help people learn, know, and like one another. It's a social function which the charter school directly undermines, only by making an appeal that the public school is so awful that you ought to be able to go someplace else because you want to rescue your kids from a lost opportunity to education, which you can hardly deny a parent. Only then can you make this crazy destruction of what public education was about become policy in this society. It is an awful index of failure. Now the public, the central bank, it's correct. We issue money as debt. All money is somebody's debt. And this means we introduce into the economy, when we introduce money, which we have to have as a growing economy to circulate goods and services, we introduce mountains of debt, which are burden on people and distort all kinds of decisions because they can't be made on terms of their own merits, but they have to take into account a debt. It's just the same as saying to a young person now, after you finished college, oh no, you can't get married, or oh no, you can't have children, or oh no, because you have a debt. Because we hung you up in order to get your education with an enormous burden that distorts and changes the decisions, and we don't care what the consequences of this are. We don't care as a society what it is doing to our people. We will pay the price for that for generations to come, but we don't take it into account in the absurd accounting system. So yes, it would be better not to have money be a debt. But here's the problem. The reason money is a debt comes from the fact when we didn't do it, when we allowed governments to issue money as was needed for the economy, guess what? Our class system meant that the politicians who were given that authority misused it. And we didn't want them to have that power because of how they misused it. So we restricted them by creating institutions like the Federal Reserve and by creating this debt dimension of money because it would hold them back. It would hamstring them from the abuses. It's a wonderful example how the system that can't work this way tries to go that way and then discovers that that way has yet another problem which you try to solve, and pretty soon you have an invention of the sort that Rube Goldberg was famous for inventing. The last question about corporations and the government is correct. I assume I don't have to tell you that corporations buy the government. If you haven't figured that out by now, I probably can't help you. Here's a recent statistic you might enjoy. I enjoyed it. Corporations contributed, some individuals too, but corporations and individuals contributed to the inauguration of Donald Trump more money than the combined contributions to both of Mr. Obama's inaugurations. In other words, Obama got less than 50 million each time. By the way, quite a party you can throw for 50 million. That's why you all saw it on television, or many of you did, and it was very spectacular because those corporations gave the money. But those corporations, having been not so friendly to Donald Trump, understood how this game is played. So as soon as he's elected for his inauguration, they gave him more money than they had ever given any president, including Obama, throughout all of previous history, to make sure that Mr. Trump once again would provide the favoritism. The leading contribution was from a man named Adelson. He is a very nice man who runs Las Vegas and who gave the largest single contribution. This has no relationship, none, this contribution, to the current decision being made by the government over whether to allow internet, poker playing, and other kind of gambling, which just happens to be a competitor for going to Las Vegas, right? It's so blatant, it's so out there, it's so obvious that anyone who gets excited that we shouldn't have something done by the government, it should be done by the private sector. Or for that matter, it shouldn't be done by the private sector, it should be done by the government, is a person who has forgotten that they only spell it differently. It's the same thing.
All right. Thank you so
Thank you all very much. Nice to see you again. How's Aria?
Thank you.
All right, well, everyone, thank you so much for coming out here. It's so good to see so many people and to see so many familiar faces. It just really fills my heart. Those of you who know our story know that we started about a year ago. Actually, I think our 1-year anniversary is going to be next month, right? Started at a little bar and a little pub in Santa Monica, and here we are today. So, and yeah. Good.
So we have monthly meetings. We create our own content. We're working on outreach and connecting. We have made a lot of incredible partnerships. Lucy, Collective Avenue Coffee, Lumio, Worker Co-op from New Zealand, who we have a workshop with next month. There have been lots of different people along the way that we're thankful to build these connections with. And we believe that cooperative forms of business are one of the ways in which we can address the many intersectional issues that are keeping so many people down today. And though often miscredited, they are efficient as traditional company, as efficient as traditional companies, more productive, longer lasting. At the macro level, we consider them to be one of the ways in which we can alter the employer-employee relationship that so odiously links us all. And on the micro level, workers and cooperatives are on average less alienated. They're happier, and that's something we can get behind.
So, hi everyone, my name is Andrea, and this is Liz
sorry, my name is Liz.
Kayla.
Forgot
Did
that
you
part.
say my name too?
I think so, but that's all right. But so we're the co-organizers of this event, and we want to just take this moment to thank you all for coming. It's really great to see everyone, and you've helped us today, and we hope that you keep doing that, like in the months that come, in any capacity. You can volunteer and so on. You want to share your pictures of the day, all that information is on there. Support us in any meaningful way would be great. That being said, we're going to get out of the way, and we're going to give you, the dessert, the first course and everything. Professor Richard Wolff.
Yes. So I've never before been compared to a piece of cake, but it's a new experience, and I appreciate it. Yes. So, what?
Good thing it wasn't a pretzel you were.
That's true. It's true. I tried to think what I might say that would be of some interest to all of you. So I came up with two things. So I'll do one and then the other. The first one is to tell you kind of what's happening in terms of how things look from New York City, where we're based. And the second is about the strategy, the political strategy going forward that you might want to think about in terms of what you're going to do. So first about what's happening. We continue to be amazed in New York City. with our own growth and with the growth of the audience for what we're doing. I won't pretend to understand why this is happening. I mean, I can say the things we can all say, the crash of 2008, the election of Trump, Bernie, the Occupy, all those things, they're all, of course, relevant. But how they came together to produce this upswing, this upsurge of interest in what we have to say is still something we only half understand, and half is being generous. And we need to understand it better to know how best to react. So it's not a minor matter to get this clear. But let me tell you sort of what has begun to happen. First, I believe we're now up to 18 groups like this across the United States. I think it's 18. If you go to our website, you can see that. The latest one, Phoenix, Arizona, Melbourne, Australia. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Groups like yours forming slowly, steadily around democracy at work, the critique of the status quo, capitalism, the system we have, and looking towards worker co-ops as a key part of where we go next, as a solution to the problems we have, or at least as an important part of the solution. So we're amazed. We're amazed that these groups are happening, that all of those issues that kept people from getting together to do the kind of thing we're doing are somehow breaking down, and people are getting together. Particularly here in the United States, you know, we have a history of at least half a century of people on the left being so afraid of getting together with other people in the same organization, having this visceral sense that that's not going to go well. That either the police will bother you, or you'll lose your job, or your friends and neighbors will look at you as if you have some bad disease that's catching, et cetera, et cetera. An instinct, don't do it. That is not blocking this. I don't know exactly why that's not happening the way it always did, but it isn't. And it isn't, as you can see, looking around the room here. It isn't. And it isn't in all these other places as well. And now what's happening to me, since I'm still much more of the public face of this than I ought to be and than I want to be. This can't be an operation that's built as much as it still is around me. It's got to have more of you doing it, speaking, standing up, being the visible faces of all of this, going out and talking to groups. I know for some people, the notion of standing in front, I don't know how many were there last night, but so we had 600 or 700 people in that church. What? Bravo. Yeah, no, we had like a huge audience in that church. Beautiful church, and they're basically filled, a big old church with stained glass windows. It was a nice event last night. These events are now common for us. 600 or 700 people, normal. I've had more. And so we need more people doing this, and we're actively looking. So those of you that think you might, do this. And those of you that are afraid because, you know, it's a little daunting to get up in front of hundreds of people staring right at you. So if you put on the wrong outfit, they're going to see. And if you stumble when you say something, they're going to be right there. It's just like riding a bicycle. After the fourth or fifth time, you don't even think about it anymore. You get up there, you explain what it is, and people are grateful for what you have to say, and they'll show it to you. Many of you have been very kind in the little minutes I've been here to come up and say something nice to me. It's wonderful. These are wonderful experiences. I'm just like you. Somebody come up and say thank you for what you do. I mean, you know, 3 people do it, it makes your day. Yeah. And those things are available because for the first time in 50 years, something is going on the left end of American politics that's at least as powerful as what's happening on the right wing. Everybody talks about the Tea Party and Trump and all of that, and that's an important part of what's going on. I don't deny it for a minute. But at the other end, I can tell you from my own experience, at least as big a transformation is underway, and we don't yet have the candidate, although Bernie came close to beginning to demonstrate that this is going on. But we're going to get them. I don't know exactly who they'll be any more than anybody else, but the audience is there just waiting for people, and it could just as well be one of you as anybody else, to emerge and be the kind of symbol, and I don't just mean one, we need a lot of people doing this, and you all ought to think about it. One of the ways you can grow as a group is to have yourselves out there. If there's a high school in the area that wants to hear about something, you send someone, and the fact that you don't know it all that well, this is how you're going to learn. Nothing makes you learn how to do this better than having to stand in front of a group of people and not make a fool out of yourself. The pressure on you when you go home getting ready, you'll get very nervous, you'll eat too much, 12 cupcakes, but you know, while they're rolling around and reminding you about your weight problem, you will actually get yourself ready and you'll go out and do it. And if you stumble a few times, so what? So you'll stumble a few times. That's how you learn, then you get better at it. You'll notice when people look at you funny that you just said the wrong thing. That's how everybody else learned how to do this. You'll learn it too. The important thing is that you do it, because that's how you'll get good at it. And remember, you've thought about this more than the kids in the high school class. You've thought about it more than the people in the Rotary Club or in the church social committee or whatever it is that you find as a way to go. And churches, by the way, are becoming very different than they've been. Half of my public appearances are now in churches. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish synagogue, all over the place. The ministers, the rabbis, the priests, and so on are changing. They're offended by Trump also in lots of complicated ways. They're shaken by what's being done to immigrants, and they're willing to begin to step up with a little bit of backbone they kind of had lost sight of. I'm being as careful as I can. And so they're allies. The union movement is in such terrible shape that they're desperate for allies, and they're increasingly open also, if not for reasons of solidarity ideologically, then just to not be as alone and as isolated and as in such a losing situation. It's very sad. But there's lots of good union people, and they have long histories, many of them, of struggle. To get them as allies would be very important for us, very, very important. And now is the time. I don't want to over-dramatize it, but having said that, of course, I will. For 50 years, really for the last 50 years since the Second World War, to be a leftist, a radical, a socialist, a Marxist, any of these words, meant you were weird, you were strange, you were ostracized from the community, you were looked at as if you were strange or crazy or disloyal to America, all those things. And what?
And dangerous.
Dangerous, all those kind of words, that's what you were. And so, and if you're considered like that, what are you going to do? You understand that people don't want to be looked at that way. What kind of life can you have? Your job is at risk, your position in your church is at risk, your position in the neighborhood is at risk. You don't want to do it. And we understood it. That's not true anymore. It isn't. I'm telling you, I went around the country in a way that probably none of you do, and I'm telling you, to my surprise, it's not the case anymore. But that implies that we don't have the excuse we had for 50 years not to get out there. We had a good excuse. It was very dangerous to get out there. It isn't now, so you don't have any excuse. If we don't do something now, it's on us. We are the ones now whose hesitance is going to kill it. Because of the freedom, to be crude about it, this government is now so busy trying to solve the problems of a system that's falling apart, which it can't do, that it's distracted. It's not bothering us. It thinks its big problems are in places like North Korea, which its Navy can't find. You all got that last week, right? It's over here and the Navy was over there. And nobody understood where any of these places were, since we have officials who can't spell North Korea. They're worried about North Korea, they're worried about Syria, they're worried about Muslims, and they're worried about immigrants. They're not worried about us. That's very important. We have a level of freedom, we have a level of opportunity. Would be a tragedy, and on us if we miss it. And it's a real window. I didn't think it was going to last. I didn't think it when everything started changing, as I mentioned to one of you a few minutes ago. Changing for me, but therefore also for you. I've been saying things critical of capitalism most of my adult life. This is not, I didn't have some epiphany last week that made me shift. I've been doing this a long time. But it's only in the last 5 years that suddenly this becomes popular. This becomes interesting to all kinds of people who heard me before and weren't interested at all. They were scared, it was dangerous, it was somehow frightening. They don't think that anymore. They just don't. They're excited. And I thought, this can't last. This is so abnormal. This is so different. But it's now 6 years, and not only is it continuing, it's getting better. I now turn away 3 out of 4 invitations I get because I can't do it. I can't physically be all these places. I'm here for 3 days. You know, I don't like this. Sitting on an American airplane is like being the sardine in the can. You know, it's no fun at all. They've managed to destroy that as an experience. Used to be exciting, now it's a major drag. Unless you fly business class, and unfortunately we don't have enough money for that. So I don't like doing it, but I can't turn this down. I did that last night to 600 or 700 people. I'm talking to you today. I talk at Occidental College this evening. Tomorrow I go to a conference at UC Riverside, you know, on and on. I could be doing this all day, every day, year round in terms of the opportunities. They're just there. Everybody knows, I'm going to go out on a limb, but everybody knows. There's that wonderful song, Leonard Cohen. I don't know if any of you remember it. Everybody knows. If you ever get a chance to hear, and just Google it, you can hear it on the internet. Listen to Leonard Cohen's song, Everybody Knows, because it's about this. It's about other things too, but it's about this. Everybody knows there's something big not working in this society. That's why we elected Trump, because everybody kind of knows. They don't know what to do about it, but they know there's something terribly wrong. And whatever that is, it's not going to be fixed by Mr. Trump. He's busy making more money. He'll do fine at that, and then he'll be done, and the next one will come in. So it's our chance. Everything is creating for us opportunities like we've never had before. And in some ways, we have to thank Mr. Trump, much as that might be difficult for all of you, because right now, he's the best organizer we have. He is. He's agitating one community after another. He's forcing people to have arguments with one another, to clarify their opinions, to understand what they care about, to be clearer than they were before about the folks that are with them and the folks that are at least not yet with them. That's very helpful to us. All kinds of ways that's helpful to us. I can see it in the people who explained to me why they invited me to come somewhere. So let me tell you a story about one of them. I spoke a few weeks ago at Sonoma State College up in Rohnert Park, California. It's, I don't know, about an hour or so north of San Francisco. Very nice place, fancy campus, a lot of new buildings, very nice. They were very kind, and they invited me to be whatever it was, Scholar of the Month or whatever it was. About to think of the old Playmate of the Month, but it wasn't that. I kept all my clothes on. They were very kind, very friendly, and when I spoke a couple months before I went out there to the president who handled inviting me, the president of the university, she explained to me why they invited me. She said, well, we've had our students here learn in many of their courses about, you know, the good things about capitalism, and it's about time they heard the other perspective. Would you please come and present a criticism of capitalism? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I made the poor woman repeat it, which she very obligingly did. And she meant it. And when I went there, that's what I did, and that's what I was asked to do. But take that, that's a sign, folks, of a lot of things, that she was comfortable as the president of a branch of the system to think like that and to reach out to someone like me to come there and present to the students. And we had a very good meeting. We had hundreds of students in a huge auditorium who had a dose of criticism of capitalism. I'm happy to tell you nobody died. Everybody survived. And we had a very good conversation, and the Q&A lasted as long as it lasted last night, till the custodian made us leave, because the interest was all there. So a year ago, I did the same thing at the University of Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky. Think about that. And I do that a lot. One of the best stations for the radio program that you get here on KPFK is in Tampa, Sarasota, Clearwater, Florida. WMNF, very important radio station, by the way. Been an independent, progressive radio station for 30 years. Huge audience. And I love going down there because part of me can't get over that I'm sitting in St. Petersburg, Florida, with hundreds of people cheering on a critique of capitalism, who listen to it every week. So this is an extraordinary period of our history. June 8th, just pick another one. June 8th is a conference in Frankfurt, Germany, because all over Europe, like in the United States, political actors on the left are gathering around the notion of the sanctuary city. The notion that it is the job of all the different parts of the left to begin thinking in terms of an alliance which begins in the protection and solidarity with immigrant communities that are being targeted as scapegoats for the problems of the societies which brought them in, after all. And that the rest of the left can find its way to ally with this effort and to ask in return, without hesitance or shame, that the immigrant communities that they're helping also help them when they need help from the immigrant community for their labor struggles, for their struggles to ask for support in building worker co-op, all of that. And so they've invited me, so I'm going to Frankfurt, Germany. German is my first language, for those of you who don't know, so it's a chance for me to speak my mother tongue. So I like to do it anyway, but this is a chance to go and to talk about how the United States is also in its way part of that. So let me turn, that's a nice segue, to the strategic imagery. Here's, and it's just speculations, but it's a speculation whose logic you'll see. How could we grow conceptually as a political movement in this country? I think it would look, well, my guess is it's going to look something like this. That our goal is to create in the United States a worker co-op sector of the economy. That a large part of the cities and towns, the states, the country, is going to see a transition from top-down hierarchical capitalist enterprises into worker co-ops for all the reasons that you already know about and that we are championing. In order for this to happen, and it's already underway, but in order for this to happen in an organized way, we need not only to start co-ops and to help in the conversion of businesses that are organized as capitalist enterprises into worker co-ops, and all of that's already happening, and it will happen more, but in order to facilitate that, in order to build that as a political movement, this transition, this growth of worker co-ops needs to have a political arm. It needs to have a political party. What would that party be and do? It would be the advocate of the worker co-op at the level of the government, whether that's the city or the state or the federal government. Its job would be to say, we are the political representatives of the desire, of the demand, for there to be a worker co-op sector of the economy so that all Americans can choose whether to buy their products from a capitalist enterprise or a worker co-op. Just like today, you can choose to buy something made in Bangladesh or maybe made in Paraguay or all those kinds of things. Now you're going to have a choice. Do you want your dollar of expenditure for a blouse or a software program to be a dollar that supports a worker co-op kind of enterprise or a capitalist? That's just as important as having a blue shirt or a yellow shirt. You're expressing a notion about what the community ought to be like, which you have the right to do. Well, you only have that right if there is such a sector. Otherwise, you don't have that right today because except for places like Collective Avenue Coffee. There we go. Unless you have such an option, and that option has to be everywhere, you don't have that freedom of choice. And ditto, this is the way this party would articulate itself, Americans should have the freedom of choice where to work. You want to work in a top-down, hierarchical, non-democratic institution? Or do you want to work in a democratically run worker co-op? In order for you to have the freedom of choice where to work, there has to be a sector so you can choose whether you want to or not. So we would be a political party that's in favor of freedom of choice. That, along with baseball and apple pie, makes us Americans, right? We want freedom of choice. What would this party do? It would push for every conceivable governmental advantage that worker co-ops could want. Let me give you some examples. A law that makes it easy to set up such a business. Such laws already exist or in embryo in various American states, including here in California, but in others as well. We want all that developed to be a generally known code, to let people know how easily they can go through the steps of setting up a worker co-op or converting from a capitalist to a worker co-op business. That's one thing we want. Here's some other things we want, so let's be expansive. We want courses in high schools and colleges about how to organize a worker co-op. The Mondragon University already has all of those courses, and they have all the reading lists, and they're all in English. So it wouldn't take us very long to set up a program, maybe 10 minutes. So, but we should require that. We should require that young people begin to know that's an option. You can set up a business this way, and the course should be elementary at a high school level and developed in college and be part of the curriculum of every business school.
I recommend a communist MBA.
Yes, right. We wouldn't call it that for obvious reasons. Good idea, but branding needs a little tweaking. Yes, right.
I'm still working on it.
But let's go a little further. Let's use the sample of something in America that's been around a long time called the Small Business Administration. Some of you may know, the SBA. Been around a long time, and by the way, reflect a very similar political history. The awareness of small businesses in America 100 years ago, that they were getting screwed in the market by big businesses who can cut a better deal with a lawyer, a better deal with the bank, a better deal. And so small businesses were being squeezed out by big businesses who took advantage of their bigness. So they developed the idea the government should, here we go, level the playing field, football metaphor, right? It's hard if you're running uphill and trying to get the touchdown. It's difficult. So you want it level. So the Small Business Administration was to do what? Arrange low interest loans for little businesses so they could get a lower interest loan without being defeated by a big bank, which you can always cut a better deal with, a big corporation that can cut a better deal with a bank. So now you get a cheap loan than you otherwise would. And that the government would commit. For example, in Europe, this is very common, that the government commits that at least 20% or 40% of its purchases have to be made from companies with less than 50 employees, so that the government as a massive buyer isn't always privileging the biggest company, etc., etc. Well, we have a wonderful menu. It's all there. We want all of that for worker co-ops. And why? Same argument. If there should be small as well as big business, both capitalist, well, there should be worker co-ops as well as capitalist business for the same kinds of reasoning. We can just borrow the language, change a few words, we're all home free. And the precedent is there. If you want more precedent, minority business administration, women business administration, we have all of that already. We're just asking for the co-op to get the same respect, the same governmental support. And then the big punch. Government has been subsidizing and benefiting capitalist enterprises for the history of the United States. And they have two political parties that do their work for them, don't they? One is called Republican and one is called Democrat. And they compete with one another to get tax breaks. What's Mr. Trump doing? He's working right now to lower the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. That's his major priority right now. You know what that is? That's a big subsidy for capitalist enterprises. All we're asking is, we want to catch up. We have 300 years to catch up on. We want lots of tax relief and lots of subsidies in order to do for the worker co-op sector what you've already been doing for the capitalist sector and never made available to worker co-ops in any kind of systematic way. This would be the political arm of the worker co-ops. Every worker co-op would have a vested interest in supporting such a political party, because what that political party did was to get the government supports that helped that worker co-op to survive. So where would the support of the party come? From the worker co-op. They'd have every reason to fund it, to support it, to get its members to become the base of such a political party, the people who become the emissaries, the missionaries, the explainers to the larger community of what they're doing. Not just doing in their little coffee business or their little home cleaning business or their little software shop, but as part of a social project to move a society from the capitalist nature that it has had to one that is more cooperative, one that is more collective. Now we have a vision for a new society. We are not just a party that supports a particular kind of business. Yes, that's where we come from, but we have a vision of a new society that everybody will benefit from. That's what you need to build a political party. That's what the left has said it needed to shape up to. It needed to find a vision that would organize, motivate, and unify it. Well, that's it. That's a recipe for a transformation. It's a justification for a new political party because it makes it crystal clear what it's there for. No mystery. And this has got nothing to do with the policies about North Korea or East Overshoe. This is about the United States and the transformation of this society to solve its problems in a better way than has been achieved until now. And this is the political party that can do that. And it can reach out from such a base to all the other potential components of a transformative project in America. Immigrants, women, ethnic minority, you name it. All of them become allies, and they're allies who will want to ally because their support for more worker co-ops doesn't violate anything they're interested in, and they get friends. Friends which in all of their struggles will be very happy to have, whether it be to protect the immigrant or to get gender equality or to get racial integration and equality. All those issues which we will embrace will be now we, the worker community cooperatives will be coming to these other communities saying, we're not here out of guilt, and we're here to make a deal. We are going to help you with the issues that motivate you. You help us with this worker co-op movement, and together we're going to change this country. That'll excite people, it'll motivate people, it will get the juices flowing. And compare that to the offer made by the organizer of the Republican and Democratic Party. It'll be easy. This is 50 times more exciting, more inspiring, has more potential to make your life better than anything they offer. And it's not about this or that candidate or none of that. The candidates should be everywhere. They should be all you, all the people that are working in worker co-ops or near them or interested in them if they're not yet ready to form them. We don't care the order. It can be first a worker co-op, then such a party. Or maybe first such a party, then help build worker co-ops, or any mix and match. It doesn't really matter if the understanding is clear. Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I understand it's hard enough to have a group like this function. It's hard enough to form a worker co-op. And then those are hard, long, difficult things. On the other hand, you'll do the particular task with much more energy and much more effectiveness if you have a vision, a sense of where you're going, a larger project that's exciting that you can explain to your sister or your cousin or your neighbor who will want to know why you're going to all those meetings. Are you in AA or what's going on here, right? You have to explain yourself. I don't mean to put any negative on AA. As I said last night to some of you, it's a model, not a model of what we can replicate if we were so strong as to be able to do what AA did. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I want you to understand that you're getting involved in something here, and I don't know whether it'll succeed. No one should misunderstand me. I'm not saying we're launched, we're going to get, none of that. I can't do that. That kind of cheerleading you needed somebody else for. But that what I just sketched out for you, that's possible, that's clear to us now. It's possible. Whether we can achieve it, we'll see. But that's kind of where things are leading us as much as we're leading them. And I'm excited beyond words that we're talking about the potential to finally change the United States in fundamental ways that we've dreamed about and fantasized about and imagined, but are becoming possible. And that doesn't happen very often in a society's history, and we really need to grab it before it disappears on us, which it might. And which the people who want to keep this society from changing will be working to make sure. And they have impressive resources at their disposal. We should make no mistake about that. But now I can say, excuse me, for the first time in our lives, we also have some resources. This is a vision and an image, and these are meetings that are real, and we have them now in the 18 cities, and the audiences we have. We're now in a position to say we have some resources that are emerging here too. And we have a more interesting and exciting vision of where this can go than the people who are trying to keep the lid on this society. What they can offer, not so good. They just gave us Mr. Trump. Not too impressive. And the people he ran against, that's why they lost. They're even less impressive. So our competition is in deep trouble. And we're rising, and they're not. And that's a precious, precious thing. So that's where my head is these days. One personal note, because some of you have asked. You've been very kind. You've said, thank you for coming out here. You're very welcome. But I want to say, as I sometimes do, I am having the time of my life. I love this. I never dreamed I would see this in my lifetime. I always knew that capitalism was heading for a fall and that the fall would be difficult. especially in this country, even more than in others, because it's got such illusions about itself and its economic system. So I knew it would be hard here. But I didn't think, you know, the luck of the draw when my parents decided to have children wouldn't work for me. I wouldn't see it. So I am seeing way more than I thought I could. Things are becoming possible that I never thought. You know, last night, standing in front of 600 or 700 people who had paid money, good money, to come and sit in that church and spend a couple hours talking about the collapse of capitalism and where we go from here, that's an amazing thing to have happened. 5 years ago, that was unthinkable. It just was. Even the people who, like Howard Zinn, who appeared in that same church some years ago, I was told last night, you know, I knew him. He knew he had to be very careful about what he said, as we all did. We all had to come up with clever ways of dancing around what we had to say, which is why the name you proposed a few minutes ago had to be pushed aside a bit. Don't take it personally. I don't have to dance around the words anymore. I just don't. As you'll see, if some of you come to the event tonight at Occidental, it's even now possible to take on socialism, communism, right on, and I will do that tonight. And I think you'll see that it'll be done in a way that doesn't scare people, doesn't make them feel we're in dangerous territory, gives them a way to understand what those things were and how what we're doing borrows from, but also differs from that in a way that is understandable and representable to other people in a way that will not only not scare them, but will actually draw them in. This is an amazing time, and I just hope that we can all squeeze this for all the wonderful juice that can come out for us all, and that it will be an amazing ride in the next few years if we can build on it and keep it going. So let me stop and whatever you want to say.